The reach and scope of the web in China can be measured in several ways, but just for a moment, consider this. The microblogging site Weibo draws monthly active users just short of 575 million. That's a lot of people. But we might also ask, and we're going to certainly discuss it tonight, how open is the Chinese internet? And how have people adapted so as to avoid being snagged by sophisticated state run censors? Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Falk, and thank you so much for joining World Now and being part of our program with Yi-Ling Liu. She's the author of a remarkable book that just was published last week, The Wall Dancers: Searching for Freedom and Connection on the Chinese Internet. Let me just mention, for those of you who may be new to our program, World Now is supported and co-produced by the World Affairs Council of Connecticut and also supported by the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, Global Santa Fe. And I'm happy to report many councils now, I think we have about 25 from across the country that promote World Now to their members as a benefit of membership. Special shout out tonight to the Asia Society Texas Center for letting their members know about tonight's program. Now, a very quick reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, and I think Ray Termini is in the audience, and I know he'll probably ask the first one, but seriously, if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A area of the Zoom screen, not in the chat, because that scrolls and I really can't follow it, and I want to be sure to get to as many of your questions as possible. I'm going to ask Yi-Ling to tell us more about her background in just a moment, because truly it is as rich and colorful as her writing. And I want to be sure that you hear her backstory. But let me just highlight that she's now based in London. She's in New York tonight, but she is based in London, where she is in residence at the Tarbell Center for AI Journalism, which supported her work on this book. If you've not yet read her articles, I hope you'll do as I did and go to Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, and other publications where her recent work has been published in long form. It's really worth it. She's been covering Chinese society for a very long time. Great to see you, Yi-Ling. Thanks for being with us. Congratulations again on the book.
Thanks so much, Jim, for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, as I mentioned in my open, I really did. I mean, it sort of dripped out in the book, your background and history. And so, take a moment and tell us from Hong Kong to Yale to London, China. Tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and I grew up there essentially until I was 18. And I went to a bilingual international school. So I've always kind of adopted this perspective of being on the fault lines of two political systems, with kind of one foot in China and one foot in the West. I can trace the seeds of the book back to when I was 15. I was already kind of an aspiring writer and journalist. And at the time, I did this summer internship at a state-run publication in Beijing. And I had made some references to the Tiananmen Square protests. And I remember my editor asking me to remove them. I wasn't naive. I knew that there were lines that could not be crossed when writing for state media, but it sparked questions that I have continued to wrestle with since. Specifically, what does it mean to write truthfully and with integrity, but within the constraints of the Great Firewall? And I took these questions with me to college. I went to Yale to do my undergrad, where I was an English major. I studied in the journalism program, and I decided afterwards that I wanted to go back to Beijing and report and write freelance. And I did a brief stint at the Associated Press in Hong Kong for 6 months, but I knew that I wanted to do kind of longer media work that really got on the ground perspectives from people in China. And so I went freelance from there on.
One thing that other reviewers have said, and I felt it too, that the book is a memoir in a sense. It's also a study of society from hip hop to LGBTQ to feminism. But it's as well as a real analysis of the Chinese internet. Was that a difficult balance for you to to write it in that fashion? Did you feel at times that one side was dragging or pulling more than the other?
Definitely. I think that was actually the most challenging part of the book. I think first and foremost, I knew that I wanted to write about the Chinese internet in a way that told the story through individuals, through actual people. I think so much of our understanding of the Chinese internet and Chinese technology from the outside can be quite reductive. China is always kind of presented as a monolith. It's always kind of presented through American national security and economic interests. And I think I wanted to force people outside of these tropes and understand the complexity of Chinese society through the lens of lived experience. So I knew that I wanted kind of individual profiles. That being said, I also didn't want a series of kind of disjointed kind of essays strung together. I wanted it to be woven into the kind of broader fabric and the history of the Chinese internet over the past 3 decades. And trying to splice up those stories kind of chronologically, weave them together, and all the while include context that would allow a non Chinese reader to understand how it all fit together. That was very, very difficult. I definitely found myself, moving between registers, also weaving in my own voice, as you mentioned. I didn't necessarily see it as memoir, but I saw myself maybe as like a zero point 0.5 subject in the five subjects that I was profiling, where my perspective was important, but I wasn't necessarily as present as like a sixth subject in the book.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that we tend to look at China sort of totally through national security or through economic ties. And I would also add who's winning or who's losing. And with you having such knowledge and experience in both societies, how frustrating is that? And do you think it's getting any better or worse?
It's very frustrating. It's very frustrating. I think the issue is that um, at core, China is always presented as this kind of unchanging monolith, right? And as I said earlier, the issue is that it's always kind of this two-dimensional projection of American fears and envy and desire. And the issue with this is that it really kind of strips individuals of their agency, and it fails to capture society in all its dynamism and contradiction. And so from the outside, you always have one of two narratives. You have China that's either going to collapse or China that's this superpower that's going to take over the world. You have China that's this unstoppable economic juggernaut, or you have China, this omnipotent techno authoritarian regime where people have no agency. And I think in some ways, with AI being in the picture, this polarized narrative, this kind of like which one is China and are we going to beat them has become more extreme. You have on one hand sometimes companies talking about how Chinese AI is the greatest threat to humanity, and then the next day you have like Silicon Valley startups kind of talking about how China is so amazing at building high-speed rail and humanoids and we have to emulate them. And I think um, my biggest frustration with this kind of who is winning race narrative is that there's so much emphasis on the differences between the two countries. And often the narrative of the race can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Sometimes you can accelerate competition or create competition when it's not even there, or the reality does not mean that two of the countries are racing towards AGI. And I tend to focus on how they're similar and their convergences because I think that's something that we don't pay a lot of attention to. But I can, of course, speak to that in greater detail at some point later.
And one of the things that I think is of concern is how few Americans are studying now in China. The numbers have dropped dramatically.
Yeah, yeah. I think the last statistic that I have off the top of my head, I think it's like 700 Americans in 2023. And
That's
I think
right.
a decade earlier, 2013, it was something like 15,000.
One of the things that I learned from your book was how much access to the internet has changed in China from being quite open to now being more censored and now being maybe somewhat more open on certain ways. Talk with us about that sort of the pull of that, the back and forth.
Yeah. So I guess there are a couple of ways to think about this. If we were to look at the broad arc of the Chinese internet and how it's evolved, it's definitely become more closed, right? I think when it was first introduced, there was a sense of opening. There was a sense of the Chinese internet user being able to connect with people, to communicate with people, to consume, to access foreign cultures in ways that they never could before. That being said, as early as the late 90s, the authorities started to construct what was known as the Golden Shield Project, which we actually now know as the Great Firewall. And on a basic level, what the Great Firewall is this filter that prevents information from coming within. So a list of banned IP addresses that can't come in. That's the kind of most concrete layer that we think of when we think of the firewall. But now that's come to include everything from top-down internet regulators to rank and file content moderators to a kind of like psychic internalized censorship that everyone inhabits. And also the type of things that have gotten censored have become much more intense. So whereas before maybe a lot of censorship was around preventing just collective action, now a lot of censorship um, tries to scrub clean anything that deviates from the party's values. So that includes everything from, I'm quoting here, like the excessive flaunting of wealth. Sissy boys is another one. Unhealthy marital values is another. So we're definitely seeing this tightening. But, you mentioned there are phases of opening and closing too, right? Like it's not always rigid in its direction. And, I can go into this in greater detail, but simply this kind of dynamic in opening and closing has been present for much of Chinese history. And I refer to the terms feng and shou in the book, which means opening and tightening. Um, and essentially, scholars have pointed out that Chinese history tends to move in these cycles of opening and closing, feng and shou. So, how it works is when the system becomes too rigid, calls for reform emerge, and it provokes a loosening, then the system becomes too open, it creates instability, and authorities step in to assert control. To just give an example, in 2011 to 2013, there was a kind of flourishing moment of free expression on Weibo, China's largest microblogging site. People were kind of speaking out, calling truth to power, calling out corruption. It was this, people were calling Weibo this kind of um, a harbinger of free speech. And then come 2013, there was a crackdown on the platform. A lot of influencers, kind of liberal viral influencers, were taken off the platform and punished, and Weibo was
What
no
was the
longer.
spark? What was the spark for that in 2013?
Yeah, a whole host of factors. I'd say maybe one of the biggest ones was actually global and international, which was the Arab Spring. I think, yeah, the Arab Spring highlighted to the Chinese government that social media platforms could be huge sources of instability. And they kind of looked over at the Middle East and said, we can't have that happen here. If Twitter was going to be this harbinger of democratic revolution, Weibo cannot do the same thing here. I think that was perhaps one of many instigators, but one of the crucial ones.
Another event that affected how China looked at the internet was the Beijing Olympics. And since many of us
Mm.
are watching the Winter Olympics now, how did that in the financial crisis impact how the internet in China was used, as well as how Chinese citizens felt about the United States and the Western media?
The Beijing Olympics is an interesting turning
Yeah.
point because, on one hand, when we look back to the moment, a lot of people call it China's coming out party to the world. It's seen as like China's entry onto the global stage as a international superpower. It's being welcomed in. It's finally allowed to host this important event. A lot of people on the ground were seeing it as evidence that China was liberalizing. So it was seen as this great opening. On the other hand, um, it was a moment of intense patriotism because China saw itself standing up again and it saw itself as kind of equals and no longer kind of subpar to the West. And so during this period, because of this kind of liberalizing moment, a lot of websites were accessible again. The firewall in some ways became freer. And you used to have all these Chinese netizens log on and they're able to access CNN and they're able to access Western media sites. And they log on expecting to kind of be welcomed with open arms and instead see all of these news stories about, criticizing China for the protests in Tibet, kind of criticism of China's human rights record. And so suddenly you have all these like patriotic netizens, and the most extreme of which actually have a name. They're called Fenting or angry youth, have such a like jarring reaction to how they think they're being perceived and how they actually are. And it creates this huge burst of nationalism and it kind of pushes nationalist sentiment to the mainstream. Um, what you were saying about the financial crisis, I think, exacerbates this even more because, this moment of China's um, stepping onto the global stage is paired with what's perceived as the West's failure to deal with its laissez-faire economy, right? So it's kind of like we are strong, they're not doing the right thing. I think at the higher political level, there's a sense of actually maybe this path of liberalization is not the way to go. Maybe we as a country should not look like what the United States looks like. And so some scholars point to this moment as kind of China also swerving off the path of liberalization and realizing maybe we should not have such an open internet.
I know that you're a dancer. I read that in the book. Tell us more about the title, The Wall Dancers, and what does it mean when you say dance in shackles?
Yeah. So the term the wall dancers, I coined that, but it comes from this phrase dancing in shackles, which is a Chinese phrase, and it was first used by Chinese journalists in the early 2000s to describe the process of writing and reporting under state constraints. But I've seen it used since then by all kinds of people, not just journalists, but also science fiction writers, musicians, software engineers. And I first heard it used by hip hop artists. And it really resonated with me, that phrase, because to me, it kind of captured this experience of living in China and navigating Chinese society as a kind of dance, this like dynamic push and pull between state and society. It captured this experience of living in China as a place that's on one hand rich with innovation and potential and yet very rigidly constrained. And I came to realize that the most dynamic dances took place on the Chinese internet behind what we know as the Great Firewall, therefore the wall dancers. And I was particularly drawn to the people, right? The individuals who were good at navigating this shifting terrain, and I came to call them dancers.
Very interesting. Let me bring in one of our viewers, Nassim Kadur. She's in California. She asks, what realities of everyday digital life in China are flattened or erased when we treat the Chinese public as a single silent audience?
So, which parts are flattened or raised? So many things. Um, I think we, for example, are always, we kind of assume that within the firewall, it's just kind of this barren landscape where no things grow. Just because a firewall exists there is no culture, there is no community, there is no innovation. Um, Back in 2014, I think Harvard Business Review published an article called Why China Can't Innovate, when in reality, this was a period when ByteDance was being formed, and ByteDance would yield the company that we all know, TikTok. Um, I like to think, I think a better metaphor for the Chinese web is a walled garden. So you can kind of think about it as this like parallel online ecosystem that just has a different array of fauna and plants that are blooming within, right? I think some people even think of a lot of Chinese platforms as copycats of the West. So people will be like, oh, well, WeChat is China's Facebook, or Weibo is China's Twitter, or DeepSeek is China's ChatGPT. When in reality, those equivalents also fall apart, right? There are different platforms that people can use, but WeChat is a super app. Like it does everything. It's not just Facebook. It's not just Meta.
One of the characters that I found so interesting was the gentleman who was Eric, who was so focused on censorship. And I'd like you to talk more about how censorship has evolved. I mean, it truly is an industry that now has thousands of people who are working on it. And do various companies like Weibo, do they have their own censors, or is it coming from the state? Is there, a real structure, a ministry of information that is responsible for this? Just to elaborate on all of that, if you would.
Yeah. I can talk a little bit about the ecosystem of censorship with regards to social media companies. But essentially, how it works is there are a whole series of internet and media regulators at the top, the most important and centralized of them being the Cyberspace Administration of China. And say something happens in the news, there are flash floods, or somebody gets arrested. The Cyberspace Administration of China will then issue a censorship directive. So it could be something like downplay the flash floods, or no mentioning of this man who got arrested. And that kind of directive will then go to the censorship department at various social media companies, be it Weibo or ByteDance's Douyin, which is a Chinese TikTok, or RedNote. And one way of thinking about these censorship directives, for anyone who's read Harry Potter, I hope this reference lands, is I don't know if you remember Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, but Dolores Umbridge would just like write these directives and put them on the walls of Hogwarts, and they were often quite vague. They were often the punishment was unclear, and everyone would just kind of have to scramble and interpret this quite proactively often. And so what happens is the censorship departments at each of these social media companies will then interpret it. They'll add a sensitive keyword to their database. They'll start scrubbing words that have to do with that incident to follow with that directive. But the important thing that I want to note about this process is that sometimes censorship doesn't even happen in response to a directive. Like it can happen very proactively. It can be a very it can be a process of self-censorship. So you can think of these social media companies as kind of eager students who want to impress their teacher before they're punished. And they'll go out of their way to kind of have these long sensitive keyword databases, because having those will protect them from repercussions down the line.
And you have in the book some of the emails, I guess, memos that Eric Liu was able to take out. And you mentioned the floods, where it said, reduce the volume of reporting on the Beijing flood, insist on positive reporting, do not make critical reports or commentary. And then another example that I drew from the book, July 23rd, 2011, after the high-speed rail crash. Report positive stories, blood donations, free taxi, do not investigate causes of the accident. So you can see that there's a great deal of control there. We have a comment or question from Cody Schmidt. Are Chinese citizens able to discuss government censorship openly, or is it socially risky to talk about it even among friends? Does this differ between urban and rural settings?
Mm. I think it really depends on the setting, like who's doing the talking, where they're doing the talking, what context it's in. I would say that in the private sphere, it's still very much possible and still okay. I think where it becomes an issue is for anyone who is a public facing figure or anyone who wants to express this on a public platform in any way. So, for example, um, a WeChat public post. I think one way of thinking about it is the larger the group that you're speaking to and the more visible the group that you're speaking to, the higher the risk that someone will shut that conversation down. So if you're having a conversation with five of your friends in a group chat, okay, you ramp that group chat up to 20, might get a little iffy. You ramp it up to 200, will definitely be an issue. Um, that's one way of thinking about it. I think with regards to an urban rural divide, I wouldn't necessarily say there's a clear difference, other than maybe people have different perspectives of how they think about censorship. There's definitely like a contingent of the Chinese population that are fine with it and are fine with existing within the firewall and see trying to jump the firewall as kind of an inconvenience, or they don't even have time to think about what is being taken down or like what information they're missing.
When you look at what's happening to large web companies, social media in this country that are now being controlled by perhaps just a few people, uh, and you compare that to perhaps the state control in China and some other authoritarian countries, do you see similarities? And do you think the United States is somewhat at risk of perhaps growing self-censorship, which perhaps we've seen with TikTok or in the past with Twitter?
Definitely. And I think this was actually something that I wasn't expecting would be so resonant with Americans and American internet users as I was writing this book. But I have found this strange convergence between the Chinese and American internets, and like the American internet in some ways starting to resemble China's. Um, just for example, to give a parallel, Weibo, the microblogging platform that I mentioned back in 2011, was called this harbinger of free speech. Fast forward to today, it's very controlled, very siloed, overrun with patriotic incels and trolls. It's very nationalist. Um, kind of illiberal voices are amplified. There is an erosion of common ground and a sense of shared understanding of the world. Um, X, Twitter, I think back in the day, if we were to think about it in 2011, it was called this throbbing networked intelligence. It was going to topple regimes in the Middle East and bring kind of a free speech revolution everywhere. Fast forward to today, my fellow journalists call it a hell site and a cesspool. And its algorithms and its content moderation are very much at the whims of one of the most powerful men in the world. Like, he might not be a state leader, but he could very well be the equivalent of one in power. Um, the TikTok parallel is interesting too, right? Because I think for a long time, um, Americans in the United States was worried about the level of influence that the Chinese government had over ByteDance, the owner company of TikTok, and what level of influence did ByteDance have over what appeared on American users' TikTok feeds, right? Recently, there's been a TikTok sale, a sale of the platform from ByteDance to a series of American companies, including, for example, Oracle. Um, but I don't know to what extent the sale has made people less afraid of the level of influence they're subject to. Yes, perhaps they might be less subject to Chinese influence, but now the question is, to what extent does companies like Oracle have influence over the content moderation on its feeds? And to what extent does Oracle's links to the current administration allow political power to shape the content on its feeds? Um, Ownership may have changed, but political power's influence on algorithms and what appears in front of us every day, the structure is still in place.
We have a question from Michael Battalion, who's asked, do you see the Great Firewall primarily as a way to stop political dissent or as a way to shape how people in China view their government?
That's a great question. I think it started out more as the former, and it started out previously more as the former and now includes the latter. And, before, I think the firewall and censorship was very much, even if you look at the type of content that was being censored, was around collective action. So it was around making sure that people didn't gather and come together. Numbers were really important. People could say whatever they wanted, or they could speak relatively freely compared to today. But as long as they didn't kind of like come together and mobilize, things were fine. This is why even patriotic, like very patriotic online users like the fencing that I mentioned earlier, the angry youth, even they were censored because they were kind of coming together too much in a way that was destabilizing. Now, I think, censoring sissy boys off television, there's no collective mobilization around that. That is a form of values alignment. That is a form of saying, we want a kind of patriotic, patriarchal vision of what a man should look like in China. And that man is masculine and fertile and not queer. And we don't want this alternative vision of manliness to appear on the web. Nothing to do with collective action. So that I think that's an example.
One of our very frequent viewers is Tarek. And Tarek, I think our guest tonight is too young to perhaps answer this question, but let me try. He asks, how does censorship before the internet compare with today? Was it more severe then or now? And have you done a
Mm.
study of Chinese censorship before what I guess we'd say the last 25, 30 years?
Yeah. Yes, I might be too young to answer this from lived experience, but my instinct and from what I've read in my research is absolutely because, the censorship, I think it also depends on the period that you're looking at. So the Chinese internet was introduced in 1995. That was when it was kind of available to everyday consumers. The period of 95 to 92 was actually one of great opening. So in some ways, you could call that small slice, those 3 years, um, as a little bit less censorship. All of the 90s things were opening. The late 80s were also a period of opening right up until the Tiananmen crackdown. So a lot of music and a lot of foreign culture and a lot of kind of ideas were coming in during that period. But I would say everything before the 1979. So for like in that period, would have had way more intense censorship than what we see on the internet today. China was essentially before 79, before 76, completely isolated culturally from the world. Like you could only listen to like communist ballads. There was no Western music coming in. Whereas, today you can listen to Eminem on the Chinese internet.
How do people jump the firewall? VPNs? And is there a risk in doing that, or is it just generally accepted?
Yeah, this one it's kind of tricky to say because I would say a lot of people use VPNs in China with no repercussions at all. I think where it becomes potentially dangerous is if you become a salesperson of VPNs. Um, a lot of, and a salesperson of like VPNs to individuals. A lot of companies like multinationals, domestic companies, even state media companies have their own VPNs. So it's acknowledged as a kind of practice. And it is allowed because I think the government realizes they need that portion of the population to have access to VPNs in order to innovate and in order to do their work properly. I'd say the big issue with VPNs is not that they are kind of not permitted or that they're difficult to access or difficult to use. It's just that most people can't be bothered to use them. Like a very small section of the population. I don't have, there's no good statistics on this now, but back in 2010, I think someone said something like 3% of the population use VPNs. And because it's just, it costs money, it's an extra bit of friction. If like I'm able to use everything I want to use within the firewall, why go out of my way to download a VPN? And friction goes a long way. Friction is actually a core part of censorship, even more than um, outright oppression.
Well, that makes sense. I have a VPN and I rarely use it because I can't get on some of the sites, especially at the community college that I want to get to. Alan Buck wonders this, given that there's such a large number of employees who act as censors, are these positions viewed by the public as desirable jobs, or do people go, you're selling out?
Absolutely not desirable. And I think, Eric's experience that I was talking about in the book that Jim, you had mentioned, um, is a perfect example of a um, a reason why someone would do the job. He graduated from college, a mediocre college, and he was like, I have no idea what to do. Um, Might be interesting to work at this tech company. I think he was making the same salary as maybe a local carpenter in Tianjin. He was working crazy hours, waking up at 7, going home 9 p.m. It's just laborious, it's tedious. You're spending hours and hours a day sitting in front of a computer, deleting words from a screen. Um, there's nothing that's
It's
kind of
really almost like
idealized
working
about it.
on the worst form of an assembly line, the way you described it in the book.
Exactly. Or like a content moderator at Meta. And a lot of that job has been, outsourced to workers outside of the United States. Like there's nothing desirable about it. It's often just like grunt work to pay the bills and have a job out after college or vocational school.
So let me bring in Ray Termini. Ray, thanks for being here. Do you, he asked, do you feel that you have to self-censor? And if so, how do you deal with it? And let me just add, is your book being published or will it be available in China?
No, definitely not going to be published in China. And I think that's perhaps one form of self-censorship, right? I think it's very intuitive. It's very hard to discern and delineate what makes sense to share and what makes doesn't make sense. I think there are no kind of clear red lines about what you can do and what you can't. I think that the one of the strengths of Chinese censorship is vagueness, right? If there were red lines, it would be very easy to follow. As long as you don't step over this, things will be fine. Um, I am a relatively cautious operator. I want to respect the boundaries and the safety of the people that I am writing about, and they too are cautious operators. And so, if they don't feel comfortable sharing something, then I won't share that, and I will proactively censor that for them, right? It's not my life that I'm writing about when I'm writing about theirs. And I think it might be a little different from conventional journalism as we see it in hard news reporting, where your kind of role is just to get the truth out and as unfiltered and kind of unvarnished as possible. Like I see my relationship to my subjects as one that's more collaborative. Like they have very generously shared their stories with me. And my role is just to humanize them, not to lay it out for the world to see in a way that makes them feel kind of at risk or uncomfortable.
It's so important for people to really understand what your views are on this. And one of our viewers asked for a little bit more elaboration. This is Val. Can you amplify the basis for what I understand to be your view that there are parallels between the China and the US internet? The government has zero capacity to issue censorship orders here in the United States. Our internet is vigorously utilized to promote collective action. Then he asks, how are there parallels in the usage and operation between the two systems?
Yeah. No, I think one thing I want to emphasize is like they're vastly different systems, right? They're completely different internet ecosystems, and I definitely don't want to imply that they are the same or that they are becoming the same. I think what I want to imply is that they're starting to be convergences. And one convergence and one similarity that I've noticed that hasn't existed in the US internet in the past is this relationship of interdependency and patronage between the tech elite and political power. Um, this is like a particular similarity that I think has arisen honestly in the past year, if not the past couple of years. It's a relationship I've always associated with China, like when the party state wants something to happen, the tech elite will quickly fall in line with that. I think I have been surprised at the extent of which I don't think it's quite an apt parallel, like a total parallel, but I've been surprised at the extent to which a lot of the big tech companies in Silicon Valley and a lot of the leaders of Silicon Valley's tech elite have aligned their rhetoric to follow the policy directives of the present administration. Um, I think I was pretty surprised during last year's inauguration ceremony to see so many of the kind of powerful men of Silicon Valley there and present and kind of nodding along with the directives of the current administration. I think we see this in the direction that Mark Zuckerberg is taking Meta. We see this in the very aesthetic that he has adopted. Um, and this is an example, this kind of confluence of power between politics and tech.
Mark asks, you say that the characters in the book were good at moving between disparate settings. Code switching may have been the term. While I understand that many marginalized people must do this, isn't it sad that they cannot be their authentic selves at all times? And from that, talk about how people do use codes from Winnie the Pooh to other phrases, and how in the heck do you keep track of what these words mean?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that it's deeply alienating at times to feel like in some moments it's empowering to feel like you can occupy multiple selves and that you can be in different worlds and speak different languages and connect with different communities. On the other hand, the fractured self is a pretty painful one. And we see this sometimes with the hip hop artists, right? They want to be able to communicate themselves creatively, authentically, but can perhaps only do that for a small audience in a small environment. Whereas if they wanted to go on stage and do that for live TV or mainstream TV, they're going to have to, curtail themselves in some way or constrain themselves in some way. And that is definitely a painful experience. I think that's like a maybe a slightly different question from what you're asking just now, Jim, about code switching and like languages and puns on the Chinese internet. But that maybe that's one of the pros of this process, where curtailing results in a kind of creativity, right? Instead of making someone feel kind of constrained or suppressed, it forces um, a kind of creative workaround. So the constraint instead forces a internet user or a Chinese person to think of a fun phrase or a piece of irony that can communicate what they want to um, in a different way.
I certainly think this is an interesting question because I feel the same way after reading your book. This person writes, although you adopt a more passive third person perspective in portraying everyday lives and struggles of the five subjects highlighted in the book, how would you say your own personal lived experience in both Western and Chinese political and social systems affected how you approached the subjects?
Yeah. I think, I, although it's not memoir, it's definitely not like objective, omnipotent, third person reporting. Like I'm very much present in the book. And I think specifically with what you're saying about my perspective of having lived in both worlds, I think it's afforded me this kind of perspective of being both an insider and an outsider. Um, I feel like with a lot of the subjects and the material that I was working with, I could be on one hand very empathetic, like we had a shared sense of stakes. I really believed in a lot of the goals that they were working towards. I felt a sense of kinship and belonging to the communities that they were part of. On the other hand, I did have also this kind of sense of critical detachment because I didn't fully belong or I wasn't fully part of what they were doing. I could kind of view the world, I could view both their words, but also like I could view China and I could view the United States with maybe some of less of the blind spots and maybe like less of the biases that we might have when we view a place that we are from or belong in. So I think that toggling helped my approach. And I also will say, like, I shared kind of personal stakes with a lot of the subjects I covered, right? I sought out the hip hop artists as I was figuring my own place as a creative person within constraints. I sought out the queer community. I was figuring out my own place in it. I reached out to the feminist activists because I was figuring out what solidarity could look like under pandemic isolation. I reached out to the science fiction writers because I was interested in what spiritual purpose could look like in the midst of technological upheaval. So I was definitely invested in what they were thinking about.
Talk more about science fiction, because I was surprised and learned a lot about how science fiction has been used in political movements and dissent.
Yeah, science fiction is an interesting one because in some ways it's become supported by, promoted by, and co-opted in many ways by the party state. It's very different from hip hop, which is very clearly an American counterculture. Science fiction is about technology. It's about progress. It's about look at the shiny new future that is being built in front of us. And so I think a lot of science fiction writers actually are have more space to dance. Like they're able to veil maybe their critique of the ugly underbelly of technological progress through some distant fictional future, right? They're able to write about a world that resembles perhaps a lot of modern day China and make critique about environmental degradation in China, income inequality, without actually explicitly referencing China itself and referencing government policy itself. So it's almost kind of dancing through the veil of the future, which has made it such a interesting and fertile medium for Chinese writers in the last decade.
The story of the feminist, I mean, I probably won't pronounce her name correctly, but Lupin, in a sense, it was tragic, great courage, but just give our listeners, our viewers, a sense of who she was and where is she now.
Yeah, so she was a journalist at a state-run publication in the late 90s. And she quit her job and decided to go freelance and founded Feminist Voices, which is one of China's most influential feminist magazines. It was. And it went viral on Weibo at the time and also became a hub for a lot of young feminist activists and sparked a kind of nationwide feminist awakening. She eventually moved to New York. She just happened to be visiting at the time when there was a crackdown on uh, there was a crackdown on a group of young feminists called the Feminist Five, and she decided not to go back. And she has been in New York. She was in New York for a few years, and then she was in she's currently in New Jersey.
And is Eric Liu, where is he now?
He is in California.
In California. So that's very interesting. So at least two of the people you profiled are now in the United States. Only two or others?
Yeah, just those two.
You have been studying the AI for so long in Chinese society, but tell us a little bit now about your thoughts about AI. Do you see it as a risk? and a threat to liberty and freedom of expression, not just in China, but even the United States or elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I'm most worried about with AI, I think it's a new technology and there are so many things, there's so many unknowns. But the thing that I'm most worried about is that it has the possibility of centralizing a very powerful technology in the hands of a small political and tech elite. I think that's maybe one of my biggest concerns. And then my other concern is that it's going to make society much more unequal and divided. I think it's going to kind of divide both China and the US, the entire world, between those who are building the technology and those who are using and being used by it.
And now that we're able to use Google Translate and other ways to follow other sites, what sites should people who are interested in going on the China's web, how should they do it? Weibo or other sites would you recommend?
I think the most popular platform right now where the most exciting conversations are taking place is actually Xiaohongshu or RedNote. I'm not sure if you remember the kind of TikTok refugees flocking to RedNote back in last January. It's a
That's
very
right. We had
vibrant
a few
space.
days when we couldn't get on.
Yeah, yeah. But Red Note is fun. There's still a lot of good conversation on there, and it used to be just used by kind of young women in urban settings talking about fashion and lifestyle. But it's since then burgeoned into a whole different app. It's become a search engine for people. People use it as a travel guide. AI software engineers are doing Ask Me Anythings on there. I think it's become much more interesting than Weibo.
And as we get close to the end of our program, Ray came back and he goes, "Have you thought about teaching courses in journalism?" I would think you'd be asked to.
I would love that. Actually, I actually enjoy teaching much more than writing. I think writing books is a deeply solitary and isolating process where it's just me and my computer. For the entirety of the day, I love working with other people. I love education. So that honestly is probably my dream job.
Well, I think you'd be very good at it. Well, again, the book is The Wall Dancer, Searching for Freedom and Connection on the Chinese Internet. I think you can tell I really enjoyed it. I wanted to read this book, but I didn't know if I would really enjoy it. And Yi-Ling is such a delightful writer, and I learned so much about society in China and a lot about our own society. So I hope you'll pick up a copy. Yi-Ling, I'm sure there's going to be lots of World Affairs Councils as well who are going to want you to come and be a speaker. So look out for all those invitations. And let me tell you about a program that we're going to be doing at the end of March. Jim Lindsay, who of course is the Council on Foreign Relations, he conducted a study about the best and worst foreign policy decisions. And I think you'll be surprised by many of them. Spoiler alert, the Iraq invasion was the worst decision. Among the best were the Marshall Plan, Bretton Woods, and even the creation of the UN. So I hope that you'll join us for that event. Registration is now open. So have a very good evening. You can always catch past programs, WorldNow, either on Apple Podcast or just go to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut site to catch up on some of the last programs we've done. Thanks again for being a part of our program. Good night, everybody.